We're joined by Mayor Steve Adler. Mayor Adler from Austin, Texas. Mayor Adler, thank you so much for being here. We're also honored to have this morning the current president of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, Catherine Tennyson. Thank you so much for being here. As well as the executive director of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, Joey Orduña Hastings. Thank you very much. This segment of our program we have entitled, When Intuition Fails, Mental Shortcuts and Unconscious Bias. To talk about unconscious bias, we have brought one of the foremost experts on this topic. Dr. Jeffrey Raklinski is the Henry Allen Mark Professor of Law at Cornell Law School. He holds a BA and an MA in psychology from the Johns Hopkins University, a JD from Stanford Law School, and a PhD in psychology from Stanford. In 1994, Dr. Raklinski joined the faculty at Cornell Law School. Dr. Raklinski's research interests primarily involve the application of cognitive and social psychology to law, with special attention to judicial decision-making. He has presented his research on judicial decision-making to audience in attendance at over 70 judicial conferences, and he has spoken to over 5,000 judges. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Raklinski?
Well, thank you. And it's a real honor to be here. I was actually in Austin yesterday speaking to your newly elected judges at the annual education conference for them, and that was a great privilege as well. When I checked into the hotel Monday night at Austin, the clerk thought I was a judge too, making an implicit assumption. Since I was at a judges conference, why wouldn't I be a judge? And I said, no, I'm here to speak to your judges. He says, oh, well, I hope you straighten them out. It's not really what I do, but I have had the privilege of talking to a large number of judge audiences. I want to start today really, much of this talk is what I give to judges, but here I want to start with a bit of a puzzle. So when we survey adults on their views of the criminal justice system, we see two things. One, sort of an eroding sense of support for it. Probably that arises from a general sense of less support for the government. And I will say the judicial branch does a heck of a lot better in public surveys than the other two, but it's still on the decline. And the other thing that's even more notable we see is an enormous split between the way white Americans view the criminal and civil justice systems and African Americans and Latinos in particular. The program itself points out that only a third of African Americans, when surveyed, actually think the criminal and civil justice systems are fair. That's about 2/3 among white Americans. So that is a huge divide. It's one of the bigger sort of racial divides you see in surveys. And it's not without reason, and that's not the puzzle. The reason, of course, it arises from a number of factors, but one of which is that it's a system that produces enormous disparities at the moment. There's mountains of statistics on this, but one I think that illustrates it the most. When you look at young people between the ages of 18 and 24 who are incarcerated for marijuana possession, consumption, or distribution, we know two things about this. One, the rate of those crimes is constant among white Americans and African Americans. There are dozens of surveys. The number of kids that age that smoke marijuana isn't different by racial demographic. What is different is what happens to kids when they get caught with marijuana. The rate of incarceration for marijuana use in the United States among African Americans is 8 times as high as it is among whites. That is a huge disparity, even though the rate of crime is the same. That's, of course, going to produce a system that not only looks unfair, it is unfair. And so the puzzle then, for me, since I've spent a lot of time with judges, I don't believe that judges are doing this on purpose, not even close. I've spent a lot of time with a lot of judges. They're very hardworking people. They mean well, and they have a deep commitment to egalitarian norms. There are always exceptions, of course. When you look through published opinions and you look through records, you can find a few judges that do give you pause, but it's a few. The vast bulk of them don't want to produce a system like this and don't want this to happen, and I expect much the same is true of the other actors in the system that produce this outcome. So the puzzle is that. How do well-meaning, well-intentioned people who don't believe that they should be producing a biased system like this and don't believe they are, nevertheless produce a system like that? And I think understanding that requires taking a bit of a step back and understanding just how our brains actually function and how they work a little bit. So I'm going to do a little bit of that. Some of the parts of the talk are going to seem a little unusual, but I think it'll draw the threads together to tell, hopefully, a coherent story about that. So speaking of unusual, I'll start with this. Look at this. Look at this slide. And what do you see? Most people see a white square. When they look at it, they see a white square emerging in your mind's eye. Particularly if the speaker keeps saying white square often enough, it'll tend to emerge from there. No one really reports, typically, that they see 4 Pac-Man style characters pointed at each other. Right? The square is there. That's what your mind's eye is going to see, not separate characters that have nothing to do with each other. That's our brain filling in the background, filling in the details, making a connection that isn't really there. Of course, there isn't a square there. My 5th grader, hopefully, would be able to tell you a square is 4 parallel lines that meet at right angles of equal length. There are no lines. They're just the characters. But the square emerges. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of what makes us smart, is that we group things together in ways that make sense of the world for us and that give us a sense of order and logic and consistency. This is not a deceptive illusion. You're not going to do anything destructive as a result of this illusion. The problem here is illusions like this can lead us astray. So look at this one for a moment. And I want you to call your attention to 2 particular squares on this checkerboard. This one that I've got labeled A, you might not be able to see the letter A, but that square, 2 in from the right on the top. Compare that to the one that's in the shadow. That's 3 in and 3 down, where the red line is pointed. It's labeled B. Are they the same shade or are they different shades? Most people will say, I think everyone I've ever encountered says, the A square, the one on the top, is darker than the one in the middle that's under the shadow. And what's happening here is our knowledge of checkerboards and shadows and how they work are telling you, telling your mind's eye, that those squares are different shades. The one in top is darker than the one in the middle, but they're not. They're exactly the same shade. If you take away all that context, all that background, whoops, and the slide, yeah, you can see they're exactly the same. It's not a PowerPoint trick. I'm not that good with PowerPoint. Just take away the background, and they're the same color. What's happening is the shadow is creating illusions. The shadow isn't actually shading that square. The creator of this creates the shadow, but not on that particular square. So the shadow creates an illusion. The context creates an illusion of something that isn't there. And that's the danger in human judgment. Our brains are very smart, very active. They fill in the details. It enables us to do all kinds of complicated chores like driving or walking down the stairs while reading, which you shouldn't do, while we're thinking about other things. But in fact, at the same time, they can create errors in judgment. How do perfectly well-meaning people produce a result that they don't intend? Is that we have intuitions about the world, and they're often accurate. But they're also sources of erroneous decisions and invidious decisions as well, and invidious judgments. Not always, not in every circumstance, and I don't tend to use the word bias. I tend to use the word implicit judgment, the way of filling in the background. But in fact, they can be a source of error. Okay. So actually, this basic thesis here arises from a lot of the research psychologists have done on human judgment and decision-making over the last 30 years. And psychologists like to talk about 2 different modes or styles of decision-making. They basically have categorized all the decisions people make into 2 different bins or 2 different modes. One bin they call System 1 decisions. It's not elegant jargon, but the psychologists are always good with it. And you think here are intuitive jargon, intuitive judgments. When people are making judgments based on their gut, based on intuition, based on what something sounds like, based on their emotions or their affective cues, they make rapid, confident judgments when using System 1. This is going with your gut, and your gut's very confident. right? System 1 judgments, intuitive judgments, are very confident, and they can be produced sort of effortlessly, right? That white square sort of just pops out. You don't have to work at it. It just sort of pops out there. The two squares, the one in the shadow, look different. They just do. You didn't do that by any kind of effortful judgment or effort. It's just there. That's intuition at work. But humans, of course, didn't get to the moon with System 1. No, of course. We're very capable of much more complicated, higher order decision-making processes, like deliberation, like relying on rules, like making calculations, like doing math, like doing deductive logic. That's what psychologists like to call System 2. And the important things about System 2, for our purposes, is they produce pretty good judgments. Yeah, of course, you can make math errors and errors of deductive logic. That's certainly true. But the interesting thing about System 2 is it's slower. It requires a lot of work to use math and deductive logic and analogical reasoning and slow down and think. That takes effort. And actually, if you use System 2, you tend to be less confident in judgment. A good example of this is I'm working very hard with my 7th grade kid, 2 years older than my 5th grader who knows about squares. My 7th grade kid is learning algebra, and he likes to use System 1. He likes to look at the problem and say, it's 7. Now, actually, he's pretty good at math, so his judgment is not always wrong. And that has taught him an unfortunate lesson, which is you can do algebra by looking at it and an answer popping out. There are math geniuses who can do that, and my son is smart, but not a math genius. And so I'm trying to convince him slowly that he needs to use System 2 to write out equations. And he'll shout at me, it's 7! I'll say, Ben, it's not 7. I've done a lot of math in my life. It's 5. Watch, I'll show you. No, it's 7! And I'm not only arguing with a child, I'm arguing with System 1. That's the powerful intuition that the answer is 7. And if he does the math, he's less sure he's right. Right? He does the math, it comes out 5, he's still sure it's 7. And that's the intuitive versus the deliberative system. Now, you might think, well, here's the problem with judgment, right? It's System 2. We need more System 2. System 1 is leading us astray. It's leading us to invidious judgments, to make assumptions about people, about circumstances. Yeah, sort of, but that isn't quite the whole story. Judging everywhere, in the courtroom, in prosecutors' offices, you need both systems of reasoning. You're not going to get through life without. It's not an idea here of getting past System 1. We're going to have these intuitions. In ordinary life, you're going to have System 1, you're going to have System 2. They're going to happen. Intuitions happen spontaneously. They don't require effort. So we're not going to not have them. So the question is, what do we do with them? It's slow down, stop, and think. You've got to have System 1. And the problem is System 1 is fast and a little bit unconscious. So sort of knowing when to stop and think is really the key to sound judgment. Knowing when to take a pause. And life doesn't always afford us those opportunities, of course. And that's where you've got to rely on something else. You've got to develop a better System 1 with training and the like. But when life does allow you to stop and think, stopping and thinking, even when you don't think you should, is really the key to sort of getting past invidious or intuitive judgments that might not be right. Now let me give you an example with a math problem of sorts. It's not a very difficult math problem, but here it is. This is one I give to judges pretty much all the time. It's a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Don't shout it out. Okay. Most people, when they see this problem, they see the $1.10, they see the dollar, and they think 10 cents. 10 cents must be the answer. If you think the answer is 10 cents, you have a good intuitive system of reasoning. Great, it's a powerful, but it's not right. 5 cents is the right answer. Why? Well, look, let me explain. So, look, if the ball cost 10 cents, if you went with the intuitive answer, that would mean the bat costs $1 more than the ball, and so the bat costs $1.10, and a bat and a ball together would cost $1.20, and that's not what the problem says. If instead the ball costs 5 cents, the bat costs $1 more than the ball, or $1.05, and together they add up to $1.10, and that's what the problem says. Now, I know a few of you don't believe me. I know this because I've given this problem a lot, and I get cornered at a lot of conferences by judges. And they usually start at this point with the word, well, professor, and for me, that's the equivalent of, With all due respect, Your Honor. I don't quite mean that. I had a judge in Indiana. I'm a tax court judge, and I know it's 10 cents. Usually I can bring them around to 5 cents, but it's a lot of work, and that's what the intuitive system does. It convinces you you're right. Just like my 7th grader. It sounds right, and so it feels right. In fact, this problem is particularly interesting. If you pay people to give you the right answer, you say, I'll give you $5 if you get this right, more people say 10 cents than if you don't pay them for the right answer. Why? The intuitive system is the confidence system. There's money at stake. I better go with 10 cents. A recent study done on Yale undergraduates, they gave them $5 for the correct answer, they gave them the problem, and they added one thing underneath the problem. They put this phrase in. Hint, the correct answer is 25% of Yale undergraduates still get this problem wrong. All right, that's the intuitive system. It's powerful, it's confident, it tells you you're right even when you're not. All right, that's math. I was promised there'd be no math, so what's this all about? Well, what we do with my collaborators and I do with judges is we show that they make this mistake too, in fact, and we learn some things from that. We learned 3 basic things about judgment in judges and in adults generally from this. First, the question, I ask a few different questions of that sort, but they're not difficult questions, but most well-educated adults get most of them wrong, in fact. Usually people say 10 cents. That's the majority answer on that problem. Second, the most commonly chosen answer tends to be 10 cents. People aren't making up numbers here. It's not random chaos. It's the intuitive system sticking that answer in their heads. And indeed, as I've said a few times now, it's a confident answer. In fact, we've asked people, how likely are other people to get this problem right? And people who say 10 cents is, well, everyone's going to get it right. It's easy. It's 10 cents. People say 5 cents know that it's a little harder. They had to do some work. Stop and suppress that intuition, not see the white square, not see the shadow somehow, or get past it in some way. And they know that's work, and so it's harder. Judges are no different. Well-meaning, highly educated, very competent professionals do exactly the same thing as most well-educated adults on this. They get most of the problems wrong, in fact, and they confidently give the intuitive answers, sometimes argue with me about it afterwards, but in fact, that's the intuitive system. Judges and we believe most actors in the legal system are people who are vulnerable to thinking the wrong thing. It's not a failing of morality in a sense here, it's just how the brain works. It creates that illusion that 10 cents sounds right, and so they should go with that. All right, that's great for math, but what about other contexts? Hopefully already this makes you stop and think, but the real key is, do judges do the same thing in other contexts? Do most adults do the same kind of thing in other contexts? Well, mostly the answer is yes, and let me give you, and there are predictable ways this happens. Psychologists study these sort of patterns of errors. One of these patterns that psychologists see are something called contrast effects, and this is an example of a contrast effect here as well. Those 2 green squares in the middle, they're exactly the same color. They don't look like they're the same color because they're surrounded by different colors, but in fact, they're the same color. It's another illusion of judgment. It's very hard to not see them as different colors because we're very good at making comparisons as human beings. Absolute judgments of color or brightness or what have you are very hard to do, but comparing one thing to another, that's pretty easy. And it leads to a particular set of illusions of judgment, just like the math problem with the bat and the ball. So here's a good example of how this does work. Marketers are very good with contrast effects. Contrast effects were in fact developed in business schools as a tool to aid salespeople. And this was a study, I'll give you an example of a study done at Cornell, in fact, in the business school. The professor there, Richard Thaler, he had these business school students, and they did some task for him. And so he said, good news, everyone gets a prize for doing this task. And he did 2 different things on different days. On the first day, he said, good news, you get a prize, and even better, you get your choice of prizes. You can have a nice Cornell mug or a pen set that says Cornell University on it. Take your pick, whichever you want. And about half the students like the mug, and they take the mug, and half choose the pens. And that's great. The next day, he does the same thing, different group of students. He said, great, good news, you get a prize. Even better news, you get 3 choices. A mug, pens, or a chewed up old big ballpoint pen. Now, None of them choose the chewed up big ballpoint pen, but now 75% choose the pen set, not 50, 75%. Why? They don't really know whether they want a mug or a pen. They got plenty of mugs, they got plenty of pens, but they do know that those pens are better than the crummy pen. So they're gonna choose that, unless they really have an affinity for coffee. It's a common marketing trick. In fact, a real estate agent tried this on me and my wife when we were looking for our first home. It's very common for a real estate agent, when they think you like a house, when they think they can make a sale, to take you to another house that's inferior in some way that's important to you immediately afterwards. Our real estate agent did that to us. There was a house in the same neighborhood that was almost identical, similar square footage, slightly different layout, but priced about 15% more than the first house we looked at. And it worked beautifully on my beloved spouse. She's going, this is great, and the other house is so much cheaper. We should get the other house. And I'm going, I know this trick. I have seen this trick. And you know what? It's working on me anyway, frankly. I really like the other house. That's a common exception. Now, does this work in professional judges, professional trained decision makers? Yes. We've tried this with judges a couple of different ways. We had a group of judges in Florida, about 200 trial judges in Florida, and we asked them to deal with a family court dispute, a custody dispute between a husband and wife. They're getting divorced, and they're fighting over custody of the kids. They can't agree on a shared custody arrangement. And so they're spending the poor kid's college fund on hiring experts. And we asked the judge, look, we want you to identify which of these experts you think is going to be the most credible. We're not going to give you their testimony, but we want you to determine which one do you think is more credible than the other. Something judges should be able to do. They're familiar with expert witnesses, even without knowing what they're going to say. And so we gave the judges, half the judges, we give them 2 experts. One, the wife's expert. She's a psychologist with a PhD from Stanford. She's testified in dozens and dozens of cases. She's very evenly balanced in which side she favors. She's got 20 years of experience. She deals with kids who are from divorced families. She's fabulous as an expert. But the husband's expert, also very, very good. He's a psychiatrist, so he's got a medical degree from Emory, also specializes in kids whose parents are getting divorced and what problems they might have. A little bit more oriented, of course, towards medical issues, like psychiatric issues than the psychologist. And also he's testified for husbands, he's testified for wives, he's done a lot of this over the years. He's also terrific. So half the judges, we just want to know which of the 2 is better. We have found judges have a slight preference overall for psychiatrists in the past, but it's very mild. A lot of them like the psychologist because they think they spend more time with the kid. Now, none of this should be affected by the addition of a third chewed up big ballpoint pen of an expert that we added. Half the judges have a third expert to choose from. He's a psychiatrist. His medical degree is from the University of Granada School of Medicine, which is not a terrible place, but he's not licensed to practice medicine in the United States. And he's earning his living working to testify for husbands. He's done it 20 times, and that's how he makes his living. That's all he says. His husbands are great. They make great parents. Their fathers are underrated, blah, blah, blah. It's the same thing. He's useless as an expert, in fact. Right? He's just been paid to say what he always says. We asked the judges in that group which of the 3 of them are the most credible, and none of them choose the chewed up big ballpoint pen of an expert. But here's what happens. So when they only have the 2 options, again, there's a slight preference for psychiatrists, and we saw that in our results. When you add a crummy psychiatrist, though, there's a strong preference for psychiatrists. The judges who are used to evaluating experts, who understand the game here of throwing experts in, now think that expert is much more credible than before, just like the business school students before. That illusion permeates. That shadow from the first slide is cast in this study as well. It's a misleading shadow, but it works nonetheless. I'll give you one more example, and we'll start to talk about judgments about people. Another way that human judgment really goes astray is with something called anchoring. Now, anchoring is very specific. It's the reliance on numeric reference points for making numeric judgments. I know that's a technical definition, so let me give you an example. If you're going to buy a new car, and you're lucky enough to be able to afford this one, and you go to the car dealer, you know that you're probably not going to pay $35,859 for that car. It might be a no-haggle dealership, in which case you would, but most of the time you can negotiate with a car dealer. You'll pay a little bit less than that. And how much less will depend upon how much you want the car, how in demand the car is, how good a negotiator you are, how good a negotiator the dealer is, and on and on. But you won't pay that amount. But you're not going to pay $10,000 either, right? So determining what are you going to pay requires anchoring and adjusting. You anchor on that number, you adjust down a little bit, and then you get an estimate of what that car is really going to cost you, and then you go and negotiate for it if you want. Okay? That's perfectly sensible, perfectly logical. Just like most of the sort of mental processes that create illusions, it makes sense most of the time. But it sometimes doesn't make sense. Sometimes the anchor is completely misleading, completely irrelevant. So there's a study done also at Cornell where we get students coming out of the campus bookstore, and you ask them, what is the average price of a textbook in the campus bookstore? And you get some number from them. And half of them, you ask them two questions. You don't just ask them that. You start with, I want to know what you think the average price of a textbook is in the campus bookstore. But before you answer, is it greater or less than $7,159.37? They go, it's high, but it's not that high. All right, what is it? And then you get a number that's 15% higher on average. They got that number stuck in their heads, and in fact, they can't let it go. Judges, you might think, well, maybe they don't anchor. They're experts. They're used to damage awards. They're used to criminal sentences. They're used to the kinds of numbers that in fact, they're fines or the like that they have to deal with. We have found that judges anchor on almost anything we give them, it turns out. I won't go through all the studies. We have about 8 studies on anchoring. Just the most extreme one. We did this one actually 2 years ago in Texas, although we also did it in Ohio. In Texas, it looked like this. We gave judges a 1-page fact pattern in which they were supposed to find a roadhouse, a new honky-tonk place that opened near a residential neighborhood. The roadhouse was zoned appropriately, but in fact, it had to stop making noise after midnight. And the first week it was opened, it didn't do that. It was open into the late hours. They had parties out on the back deck, got lots of complaints from the neighbors, in which we described in some detail. They've stopped doing that now. They've behaved themselves. But in fact, they're hauled before court, and they're going to get fined for this conduct. We told the judges, look, you've got to impose a fine, and the municipal ordinance that's relevant here says you've got to impose a fine that would reflect the degree of disruption that they imposed and would deter further offenses. So it's very unguided, but it's the kind of thing a lot of the municipal court judges we had done. It's not unfamiliar. It's a familiar task that they had to do as a professional in an even-handed way. And we varied one thing for these judges. For half of them, we called it Roadhouse 58 after its street address. And the median fine for Roadhouse 58 after its street address was $500. The other half of the judges, we called it Roadhouse 11,866 after its street address. And the fine was 3 times as high. I have advice for Roadhouse 11,866. Change your name. 2 of the judges actually fined them $11,866. No one fined them 58. Right, that number got stuck in their heads and anchored their fine. Now, if something as subtle as that can affect how judges think about a case, then that got us to worry. Well, lots of things must be in the background to create the kind of illusions that we see in normal adults and undergraduates and elsewhere that might be a little more invidious than this, than the sort of games that we're playing in this. And so we wondered about in-group biases, because a common form of sort of mental shortcut that can create illusions is simple favoritism for a member of an in-group. And this is an ancient observation in psychology and social science generally. This is William Graham Sumner, a well-known social scientist from over 100 years ago. He says, look, every group nourishes its pride and vanity, boasts itself superior, and exalts its divinities, and looks with contempt upon outsiders, almost however that group is formed. And there's an endless series of experiments in social psychology where you take grade school kids and you divide them based on their eye color, blue eyes, brown eyes, and then they start beating each other up. Or divide them in all kinds of ways. It's not difficult to establish a group identity, and it can be very powerful and very pervasive. So in judges, we wondered about this, and in particular, we wondered something sort of straightforward at the outset. Look, do judges discriminate against folks from a different state? Right? Now, let's talk about race or gender first, but just a different state. And we did some research, and we found that not all these biases are implicit. This is a former Chief Justice of the West Virginia Supreme Court. This is his quote about out-of-state litigants. He says, as long as I'm allowed to redistribute wealth from out-of-state companies to injured in-state plaintiffs, I shall continue to do so. Not only is my sleep enhanced when I give someone else's money away, but so is my job security because in-state plaintiffs, their families, and their friends will re-elect me. I quote that because I know that he meant it. I've got some interactions with him. And that's not implicit bias, obviously. That's explicit bias. So this is what I'm going to do. And when we presented this slide to groups of judges, they react as you did, with some sort of contempt and like horror or even amusement at the whole thing, that is not appropriate conduct. But implicitly, do judges do this? Now, we had a group of trial judges in Minnesota, basically every trial judge in Minnesota. They were at the annual education conference. There were 300 of them there. And Minnesota was a great place to study this in a way because they have a rivalrous neighbor state, Wisconsin, in fact. Minnesota and Wisconsin, I gotta say, I didn't grow up there, and I apologize if you're from there. I don't really distinguish much between Minnesota and Wisconsin. They look like kind of, but they do. That's fighting words in Minnesota and in Wisconsin. You say that there, they get annoyed, and they can check off all manner of differences between the two states in lots of ways. And their high school football teams play rivalrous homecoming games against each other. Their NFL teams are rivals. It goes on and on. They view each other in the same way William Graham Sumner described it, although, of course, they're really not all that different. So we had these Minnesota judges, and we gave them a one-page fact pattern involving punitive damages. Now, punitive damages, of course, are damages in a case where someone's done something wrong, not in a criminal setting, but a civil one, that are meant to express outrage and to punish them for some egregious or extremely reckless misconduct. So we wrote a case about extremely reckless misconduct. We told the judges a story about a defendant in a civil case who had in fact owned a fairly mid-sized business with revenues of $5 to $10 million a year. And this CEO of this company, who was his family owned, he owned the whole thing, has to handle hazardous chemicals and as waste products for some of the processes he's engaged in. And he got sick of paying for the way of disposing them appropriately, and so he began driving them 20 miles away and dumping them into a lake. That lake was on private property, and during a hot summer day, the plaintiff, who's a good Minnesotan farmer, of course, swims in the lake and gets very, very sick, suffers arsenic poisoning. At this point, I think we overdid it a little. We said he lost a kidney, he suffers nausea. You can get quite sick from arsenic poisoning, but no matter. So it's really egregious conduct. He's poisoning a private lake, a guy swims in it, gets very, very sick. There's no question but that the defendant is liable. We told the judges all the compensatory damages, those to compensate the plaintiff for his injuries, those have been settled. The defendant's agreed to pay all that. But he doesn't want to have to pay punitive damages. So we asked them whether they would award punitive damages in a bench trial, a judge trial, and if so, how much. They basically all did award punitive damages. It was pretty reckless conduct. And we varied one thing. For half of them, the defendant is also a Minnesota citizen. The other half is from Wisconsin. Again, still 20 miles, nothing really different about this. It just happened to cross a state line when he did this. And so here's the median damage award. What I mean by that is half the judges awarded more than this amount, half awarded less. When it was a Minnesota plaintiff who sued a Minnesota defendant, $1 million seemed appropriate to a lot of the judges. A lot of them awarded that amount, some awarded more, some awarded less. That's our median amount. But when it was one of those damn Wisconsinites, $1.75 million was the right award. The whole distribution of awards from top to bottom was shifted upwards. They're outraged. There's a lot of data on punitive damage awards that suggests that people award it out of a sense of outrage and disgust at the conduct. It is somehow more outrageous, more disgusting when it's an outsider. Okay? That, I think, also is an illusion. The judges themselves rejected the idea that Richard Neely articulated, that you should be redistributing wealth in this way. They think that's outrageous. And yet, implicitly, they still do it. And it's because of the illusion, I think. They feel differently about the case when it's an outsider. It looks different. It sounds different to them. Even though it's not. We have replicated this in a few other states, but it's actually hard to replicate that rivalry between the two. We did this with New Jersey and Pennsylvania, but it turns out half of New Jersey is rivalrous with my state of New York. And there are other funky rivalries, like Texas and Oklahoma. I think it would work in Oklahoma. I'm not sure in Texas, but we'll see. Okay, so that, of course, then leads us to think about judgments about people. I very much like this slide, this misleading implicit judgments. Only one of these two people has been inside federal prison. This is, of course, Snoop Dogg and Martha Stewart, who now have a TV show together. This was a Christmas special they did a few years ago where they make brownies, which is hysterical. It's Snoop Dogg's own recipe, he says. All right, but of course, judgments of this sort can be misleading. And let me give you an example of this. Let's try this one. I give this problem to my students a lot. A father and a son are in a horrible car crash. It kills the dad. The son is rushed to the hospital, and just as he's about to go under the knife, the surgeon says, "I can't operate. That boy is my son." How is that possible? It's his mom. Of course, you title the session Implicit Bias, and you're here to talk about bias, you come up with mom. Only 1 in 6 of my students gets that, if given cold. And I confess I got that problem. I was toying with logical, maybe stepdad, couldn't get to it. Of course, it's his mom is the surgeon. This is my wife. My wife's surgeon, who saved my wife's life. I will never make that mistake again, which is the power of role models. Right, but only 1/6 of my students, given enough time, as much time as they want, can come up with that. They mostly end up puzzled by the whole thing. How could it be the dad is dead? Right, they're thinking of Marcus Welby. They're thinking of the male surgeon, of course, and they can't get that out of their heads to think outside the box, as many of you did. And we do see a lot of data on gender and unconscious bias in exactly this way. There's a fair amount of data that suggests that most adults much more easily associate male-oriented concepts with career-oriented concepts, and female, names or words like aunt or uncle or the like with words that involve family and home and domestic life. Psychologists have very careful ways of measuring these sorts of things, and I'll give you a few examples of these as the talk goes on. And most adults, even professional women, in fact, harbor that same association. I harbor this association very much. My wife, when we had kids, stays at home, and I've taken tests that psychologists give. I have a strong male career, female home association. It's not the thing that makes you a bad person, but it is in fact the kind of thing that gets produced because of who you are, what you experience, and what associations you have. It's the brain trying to make natural inferences based on what it knows, based on what it's learned, just like it's made inferences based on the checkerboard. It's not that surprising. The real problem, of course, is whether it influences judgment or not. I'm very conscious of this when I have to grade my students. In law school, about half of them are men and half are women. We grade the exams blind, which is very helpful. I don't know the gender of the student. I really very much dislike when they write a very neat smiley face at the end and write, "Have a great semester," and put little smiley faces with exclamation points, because male students tend not to do that. And that kind of gives away the gender of the student. We've now gone to typed exams. I can't tell anything about who they are, and I like that. It helps me grade them in a blind way, helps me not think about them in a different way. And I have actually had students come to my class and count how many students I call on, and how randomly do I do it, and how long do I spend on the students, to try to give me feedback on whether I'm calling on the male students more than the female students. And in fact, I've gone to flashcards. I just flip the cards and call the card out at random. And so I can't then express that implicit bias I have. Anyway, so we have tested gender biases in judges, and I will say judges will surprise us very often. It's not the case that every one of these implicit biases we find when we study them turns into a result. And I'll give you some of the counterexamples here. Here's an example of something that turned out the opposite of the way we thought it would. We gave judges a fact pattern, and this is judges from a couple of different states, in fact. We gave them a family law case which involves a difficult problem for family court judges, one involving parental mobility. Our story was that a couple had gotten divorced, and they have two young children, and the one parent is working actively in the workplace, has a career going as a lawyer in a big city law firm, and the other parent is staying at home to watch the kids. And that's the custodial parent. The custodial parent then gets an opportunity to restart their career, but in a distant city. They get a terrific job offer 300 miles away, and they want to move with the kids. But the non-custodial parent opposes this. The move is to a small town. They won't be able to replicate their career in the small town. They say they will follow the kid, but they'll lose their career if they do that. And the custodial parent, of course, wants to move and restart their career. So the question is, will the family court let them do that or not. And we have two different versions of it. Nothing very elegant here. We just altered the gender of the parties. For half of them, it's the mom who's the custodial parent, and we say she's a geologist and has got this job offer in a mining town where she'd be head geologist. It's a great job for her, but in fact, the dad, who's a big city lawyer, don't want to do that. Or it's the other way around. The dad is staying at home and he's the geologist. Very, very unusual. Stay-at-home parents tend to be moms, of course, but we just equalized all the other facts and just switched the genders. Our thinking was, well, look, if judges harbor these the gender biases of associating men with career and women with home, then they're not going to let the mom go. Right? She's supposed to stay home and watch the kids. Well, actually, that's not what happened at all. I'll show you the results. When it was the mother who wanted to move, no, she got to move. 80% of the judges thought they would approve that. They'd allow the mom to go and restart her career. Dad, not so much. More like 50-50. And when we asked, so we were surprised by this, and so we asked a lot of the judges what they were thinking, what they thought about. It turned out when they had the mom, most of the judges who let the mom go said they were thinking, well, no, she's going to take care of these kids. She's the mother. If they have a sick day, she's going to stay home from work. She's going to put the kids first. And and we're supposed to focus on the best interest of the child. Their lives are not going to be measurably worse. They're going to be just as good. The mom is going to make sure of that. When they had the dad, they were worried about the kids. They were worried the kids wouldn't be taken care of. They were worried about the nanny that might get hired. They were more concerned. That is the gender bias, of course. It's just coming out in a way that's not really what we expected at all. And it is increased in a way that you do see in family court decisions in that sense. It's not, by the way, also necessarily wrong, right? We don't have hard data on who's going to be a better parent under a circumstance like that or not. But that's the kind of abstract environment in which people start to rely on those implicit associations of mom with home. So she'll be at home, even if she's got a career. Dad at work, well, he's going to leave the kids with the nanny. Right, that's the association that we think drove that distinction in this case. So implicit associations, look, we know that as psychologists, people harbor a variety of implicit associations. That male career, female family one is just sort of a tip of an iceberg. There are lots of them, and they can influence judgment. They don't always, but they can actually influence judgment. Let me give you another example for all of you. Take a look at this photo. I'm going to ask you a couple questions about this person. Get an image in your mind of what you think she's like. Does she like baking? Most people think she does. Does she like small children? My grandmother actually did not like small children, I will say, but most people think yes. Does she get offended by nude scenes on television? She looks like she would be, right? Of course, those are implicit associations. And again, they're not necessarily wrong. You might really be right. How about this person? Probably doesn't like baking. Does he like to read? Doesn't look like a reader. Is he aggressive? He does look aggressive. Not sure what that gesture means exactly, but it might be aggressive. Does he support affirmative action? Probably not. Probably not affirmative action fan. I will say I picked this photo in particular because this looks. I have a student this semester in contracts that looks really a lot like this guy. He is going to be one of the, he will be a very serious defender of affirmative action programs. In fact, he is a committed egalitarian. He's going to be a great lawyer someday. But he looks like this guy. He's got a tattoo and everything. You meet him in a dark alley, you'd be afraid. I would. I was afraid of him the first time in class. But that is not what he is at all, of course. So is the implicit bias leading in the wrong direction? Maybe not, but it's certainly going to make some mistakes. Let's try this one. How about this person? Does he like math? Looks like he likes math. Is he good at sports? No. Does anyone know who he actually is? Go ahead, who is it? It's Jeremy Lin. He's very good at sports. He's a starter in the NBA and has been for years. Interestingly enough, NBA coaches and general managers have admitted that they passed over him because he's Asian. In fact, very publicly done so. He was not drafted in 2010, even though during the summer league before, where they sort of try out players, he actually had better stats than the #1 draft that year. And in fact, in very careful measures of his athletic ability, he really outperforms most NBA players. He's really quite terrific, but that implicit bias really hurt him. He spent some time living on a friend's couch after he wasn't drafted. He's an excellent NBA player, but in fact, he just doesn't look like one. At least not in this photo. You put him in a uniform and give him a ball, he looks a little closer. All right. So now, again, the implicit biases, they're there. Of course we have them. My students will admit to that. When you see those photos, they do the same thing that most of you probably did. But what effect does it have out there in the world? I want to show you a video. It's about 4.5 minutes long. It's well worth the price of admission, I think. So let me show you that. Another example of invidious or implicit biases.
You see this and you wonder, did he lose his keys or is he blatantly stealing that bike? In broad daylight, he hammers and then saws on the chain. When that doesn't work, he pulls out an industrial-sized bolt cutter. And when he's asked, he fesses up.
You lost the lock?
No, not exactly.
But he's not a real thief. Justin Kelly is an actor, and our hidden cameras are rolling.
What happened? Nothing. I can't get through the lock. I mean, I know this is weird, but you wouldn't happen to know whose bike this is, would you?
Yeah.
All right, good. Thank you.
It was odd that somebody had all that equipment.
But you didn't do anything.
No.
That's true.
That's the bottom line.
Lots of people stop and stare. A few even question the actor.
I guess I have to ask, is that your bike?
I guess technically no.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Good luck.
In over an hour, about 100 people pass by. Only George and Arlene try to stop him. Some tell us they plan to call the police later. Others say they're scared. Keep moving. This woman and her friends give our thief the benefit of the doubt. When we ask why, Bisa Washington tells us first impressions matter.
I remember thinking young white men don't usually carry burglar tools.
So we all make assumptions, huh?
Yeah.
I'm thinking maybe he works for the park.
We replace our white thief with this young man, Matlock. Remember, both actors dress in a similar way and are about the same age.
Is that your bike?
Nah.
Then what are you cutting the chain for?
Right away. Right away somebody yelled. Wow.
Within seconds, another person confronts our thief.
Is that your bike? Technically, it's not, but it's gonna be mine.
More people converge.
Is that on the cell phone? You call the police. He's like stealing somebody's bike.
Oh, you taking that bike? Is that your bike?
No, it's not, sir.
Oh, why are you doing that?
Is this? I mean, is this any of y'all bikes? Is this your bike?
It's not. It belongs.
No, but
whoever's it is, it belongs to someone.
To who?
Well, not to you.
And sure enough, one man whips out a cell phone to call 911.
Yeah, there's someone taking a bike here.
Our actor triggers more reaction. Some people are even snapping pictures for evidence.
I got you, bud. I got you.
Guy's stealing a bike. Whose bike's over here?
Once everyone moves away, we reset our cameras, and within minutes, another outraged man is yelling.
Are you trying to steal that bike?
Excuse me, sir, but the bike's been here for days. Like, no one's gonna take it.
Well, that's not your bike then.
Yeah.
You can't just come in and take something from somebody.
Excuse me, sir. I'm
Okay, I'll just take your tools away then. You sure, sir?
Please, sir, don't touch my stuff, sir. Please, sir, do not touch my
Well,
stuff.
you're touching
please.
somebody else's stuff.
Yeah, all right, but this has been here. Like, who's gonna take it?
Well, that doesn't make it your property.
Technically, it does.
No, it doesn't. Technically, it's not yours to take.
All right, sir.
When we bring out our cameras, David Robb wants us to go after the thief.
That kid in the red shirt.
He's hacking away at a bike that's not his.
Days, and he has a right to take it and steal it. And he's come here with...
She may not look like your average bike thief, but actress Ashley Carpenter makes sure anyone who asks knows she's up to no good.
Need a hand?
You don't know whose this is, do you?
Whose bike it is?
Yeah.
With a little help from Ed Fitzsimmons, the bike chain easily falls away.
Drop everywhere. Oh my goodness, what a strong man you are.
And he isn't the only man who stops in his tracks. What's this guy thinking?
You know, you pull up, you don't know if she lost her key, if she's trying to actually take the bike, but then again, she's a girl. And would you ever see a girl doing that?
Steal?
You never know. Most of the times it's a guy gonna do something like that.
Reginald pedals right past his appalled wife, straight to our actress, asking her if she needs a hand.
Okay, I'll eventually get it.
I did some time in Norway. I can steal this.
Oh, you can steal it? Maybe you can help me steal it.
The girl at the end is almost, it's almost incredible, right? People actually help her steal. But I think that the difference between the African-American kid and the white kid is, it's really palpable. The white kid, the video setups, they left him there for half an hour before people started confronting him in any kind of way. The African-American kid was immediate. And the reaction's completely different. You heard what people said. They start by saying, no, I didn't want to get involved, I was a little afraid. Not when it's the African-American kid. The reaction there is outright anger, right at the outset. It's that emotional reaction that you see in that video. It's always very striking. And again, I think it's people would not describe themselves as racist. The guy who confronted the kid would say, no, he's stealing a bike, I'm doing a do-gooder, I'm doing something. Yeah. Of course, that would be the description the person would give. I would confront anyone who was stealing a bike. Well, now we know that's not true because we see the video elsewhere. And what do we know about implicit bias? A few things, right? That most adults harbor a variety of implicit biases. One of the most commonly, widely studied one among white adults in particular is the tendency to associate white faces with positive imagery and African-American faces with negative, sometimes even violent imagery. And again, you see the male career, female family one as well. African-Americans are a bit different on that. There are, it's about split. About half of African-American adults will also have a white good, black bad association, often not as strong as the average white adult. But about half will also have an African-American good and white bad association. So there's much more variation among African-American adults. Latinos are somewhere in between, and you see the effect for Latino versus white as well. It's just smaller. It's just not as pronounced. That distinction, white good, black bad, among about 80% white adults, that's very common. These associations do sometimes influence judgment. They don't always. There are a couple of studies of note where we know how closely the person associates white and good and black and bad, and we know something about their behavior. There's one that was done on cardiologists. They gave a group of 200, researchers gave a group of 200 cardiologists a case study involving an individual who was described either as Caucasian or African American. And a good chunk of the cardiologists didn't differentiate. They gave a diagnosis of the person and articulated a treatment plan, and it didn't matter whether they're white or black. But it did matter among the cardiologists who had a strong white good, black bad association. They did produce a different diagnosis. So it was that association then that was creating that difference. There's a study, it's not a study in the US, but it's worth noting, it was done in Sweden, where the association is white good, Arab bad. Not African American, so it's Sweden, but it's among Arab immigrants. The study was done on human resources directors. What they did is measured their association between white and good and Arab and bad, and found it varied. And they took the subsample of those human resources directors who had a strong white good, Arab bad association, and then measured what their ratings of Arabs versus white employees were in their organization. So it's actual decisions they made. It's not a hypothetical at this point. And they showed a difference. But again, among the Swedes who did not have that association, they didn't really show any difference. Right? So it's that implicit association driving it. And that probably one of the most striking studies in this area, done about 15 years ago now, white adults who have a strong white good, black bad association, when they process African American faces, this was done using an MRI, use different parts of their brain to assess African American faces and white faces. There's a sort of a designated part of the brain that's good for that's used for facial recognition, very closely connected to a lot of other social functions in the brain. That's not the part of the brain that white adults who have the strong association use when processing black faces. They use the amygdala, which is more associated with fight and flight responses. All right, you don't see that in white adults who don't harbor that association. And you don't see it in African American adults at all, which is a little more complicated, but you don't see that. It's that invidious association that's there that does sort of trigger judgments in those particular ways. Now, I do want to say something about how we measure that. So some of you have probably seen this research. So how do we measure it? A lot of psychologists will use what's called the implicit association test. Basically, the implicit association test measures, how do we measure these associations between categories is really the question I'm asking here. And what we do is use a standard computer task. You'll see a screen that looks kind of like this when measuring the association, right? And it'll say white or good in the upper left and black or bad in the middle. And then what'll appear in the middle is a face. That's a white face. So the keyboard's been designated, so you press a key on the left, the E key. If it's a white face, you press the I key if it's an African-American face. You press the E key if it's good, the I key if it's bad. So here's a good word, happy, that's good, you press that. Awful, that's bad, you press that. And the computer all the time is measuring how long it takes to give you an accurate response. If you press the wrong key, there's a little X, you probably can't see it here, the light's not quite right. You get a little X, and the computer just waits until you press the correct category, left or right. And it's measuring to the millisecond how long it takes to sort this task. When I say that most white adults are more closely associate white and good and black and bad, what I mean is they're faster on this task than this one, where you move where it's black or good and white or bad. Right, so if you switch the location of these things, and you can control for the order, it doesn't really matter, that this is harder for most white adults. Why? Because effectively in the first version where it's white or good or black or bad, the psychologists think you're just kind of making one judgment, positive, negative, positive, negative. That's easy to do. This, it's not a difficult task, but it requires two judgments. Is it a face? Is it a name? Is it black? Is it good? Is it bad? Right, so that takes a little bit more cognitive effort. And if you're a lot slower on it, you do feel it. I've done this many times with these things. It can feel harder. It just is more work to sort categories that are, to you, incongruent in some way, that don't go together as easily. That's why male and career and female and family, that works as well for most adults. And so that's what I mean when I say they don't associate them as closely. That's how we're measuring that. And we correlate that, as I said, with various judgments, like the cardiologist, the employment decisions, and the amygdala activation. Right, so when we have people who are slower on this, it actually does translate into judgments in some settings. Here's a study, a very recent study that shows another way psychologists get at this association. It's a little bit recent, but it's worth reviewing. These researchers, what they were doing is they took adults from the community. The study was done in Iowa, and they primed them with faces of kids. They either showed white kids' faces or African-American kids' faces, and they varied during the course of the task. And the task was to sort an object afterwards. They had to sort either a child's toy or a weapon. So that what they were doing is they'd show them a white kid's face and then say, okay, the next screen is either going to be a toy or a weapon, pick the right one. And they made it hard by showing the toy or the weapon very, very briefly, only for a few milliseconds. And so it was possible to sort it, but people made a lot of mistakes. And they either showed the white face and then the toy or the weapon, or the black face and then the toy or the weapon. Again, they're only showing kids' faces too. Kids' faces as well. Here's the pattern of errors. So when they show a white face first, the research subjects were more likely to mistake the gun for a toy. So they'd misidentify the gun as a toy, much more often than they'd misidentify the toy for the gun. When they saw the black kid's face, and again, this is a cute 7-year-old kid. We're not showing anyone who would be described as violent. Then they start to misidentify the other way. They misidentify the toy as a gun and the gun as a toy, very much less. Right? So they're more prone to seeing the weapon when they're primed with a black face, more prone to seeing a toy when they're seeing the white kid's face. Right? And there's a lot of studies of that sort, the sort of confusion studies that look like that. Does this translate to the real world? Again, we have some complicated data on this. This was a study done 13 years ago. Very depressing study in a lot of ways by 2 economists, in fact, at MIT. What they did is they made fake resumes. And they changed the names on the resumes. They put Emily or Greg or Lakeisha or Jamal as the first name. They kept very common last names on there. But they changed the first name to suggest a gender and a race. And they sent them to thousands of employers, real employers, who actually advertised for jobs. And they have the same phone number on all of them. The resume was otherwise identical except for the name. And all they wanted to know was how many employers call back based on their name. The callback rate for the white names, 10%. Callback for the black names, 6.7%, 2/3. That's not even the worst part in some ways. The shadow being cast on this study is they had a version in which they added credentials to the applicant. They would add that the person had a college degree or relevant experience in the field. When they did that for the white names, it improved, both of them improved the callback rate, but had no effect at all on the African American resumes. Putting on college degree and then putting on experience in the profession, the callback rate was still the same, was still about 6.7%. But the white ones went up to 20%, right? So they were attending to those, but not really attending to those things on the African American ones. That's the illusion going on in that study. That's the shadow being cast. Doesn't matter what else you put on there. It's an African American name, right? It doesn't add to the value. This works in reverse too. This was a study done by the ABA just a couple years ago. They got 60 partners at large law firms to evaluate a legal brief. The brief actually wasn't very good. It contained several errors, including some spelling errors, which I always tell my students is the kiss of death. Right? Don't include spelling errors. That's easy to fix. So it's a brief. It's okay, but it's got a lot of mistakes in it. And what they said to the partners is evaluate it on a 5-point scale, which is actually very common in a large law firm, from really lousy to very good. And what they varied was the author. The author was either, the writer, it should say, the writer was either white, and when it was a white writer, they gave the brief an average of 4.1 out of 5. When it was African American, 3.2 out of 5, a full point lower. And when you asked them, they pointed out the errors. And again, of course, they don't think they're being racist, just like the folks who are confronting the bicycle thief don't think they're being racist. They're saying, look, there's spelling errors in it. They actually see the errors in a different way. They see the mistakes differently when it starts out being labeled as an African American as an author than as a white person. So we do kind of see that. Again, we don't know, is this more common among the folks who have that invidious association or not? In these data, we don't know that. But in fact, we know that association is out there, and we know it can be acted on. Here's a study we did with judges. And I will say at the outset with judges, we've done a number of studies where we vary the race of litigants and judges. We've done cases involving, in the criminal context, where we've asked judges whether the person should be found guilty or not. And actually, we don't see effects among judges. We vary the race of the defendant. We don't really see anything. We've done a number of sentencing problems. We don't see any disparities. The judges treat them the same. But that's a context in which judges are very much on guard, especially when they sort of see us coming, right? The session will be titled Implicit Bias. We had one, Implicit Bias, How You Are a Bigot. I'm like, really? Do you have to title it that way? Like, I don't do that. I didn't use any of that so-called data from that session. But they're on guard for us, and when we clearly identify the race and they're on guard, we don't see effects. That's good news, right? That means people can, in fact, engage their deliberative functions, get past the illusion, and think carefully about it, and look at the things that they're supposed to look at, like the criminal defendant's history, their background, what was the crime, the things you need to look at to sentence a criminal defendant. All right, but this is a study we did with judges. We showed them this photograph, and there's a face that's been photoshopped in it. It's on the right. The circle might be a little hard to see. It's probably easier to see on that side of the room. That face we photoshopped in. And all we did is early on in a presentation to judges, we showed them this photo for 5 seconds, and we said, we're going to ask you a question about it later. Just look at it, give you a question. The question later, about an hour later in the presentation, we told judges, we're going to show you a lineup. One of the faces in that street scene you saw earlier on in the talk was someone who's now accused of a crime, and we want you to pick them out of a lineup. And we promise the person really is in the lineup, which is true. And we had the judges first read about the person's crime. Half of the judges read that the crime is an armed robbery. The person comes in the middle of the night to a gas station, fires off a gun, says, give me the money, I'll kill you, don't think I won't, something violent like that, and walks away with $170. Or the crime is the person is going door to door, pretending to be from a charity, but he's not, he's the charity. And he manages to pilfer $170 from an elderly woman who gives him the money for this hypothetical charity, which he then pockets. And he gets caught later, and so the question is, can you pick him out of a lineup? Now, here's the lineup. We gave them 5 photos. The middle one is the target. The order in which I gave them is the numbers on the bottom. But I reordered them here because these faces have been rated on the degree to which they are, this is the quote, stereotypically African American. All right, now this was done actually by Stanford undergraduates. And you get Stanford undergraduates here. You're going to be rating faces on the degree to which they're stereotypically African American. It's a good politically correct institution. They say, I don't know what you're talking about. I can't do it, can't do it. Hey, just do it. It'll be fine. And actually, it's quite reliable. Right? What do they cue off of? Darker skin tone, thicker lips, that sort of thing. So that it's a little hard in this light, but the face on the right is a very dark-skinned man. He's got a wide nose, very thick lips, and so the undergraduates rate him as stereotypically African American. They do so very reliably. That is, from one subject to the other, you get kind of the same rating. Guy on the left actually looks like he's more South Asian, Indian perhaps, than African American, and you have followed by a fairly light-skinned African American, and the guy in the middle is in the middle of the 3. And here's what happens. About a third of the judges actually pick out our target. It's pretty good, actually. We only showed the thing for 5 seconds, but they're pretty good. But we're not interested in the correct judges. A third of them get it right regardless of the crime. We're interested in what they do when they don't know. What do they guess? Well, here's what they do. When the crime was armed robbery, when the crime was fraud, 75% of them pick one of the lighter skinned two, one of the less stereotypically African American faces. When it's armed robbery, 80% pick one of the darker skinned individuals. Right? It's a complete reversal. When they have to guess, they go with someone they think looks like an armed robber. That's going to be a more darker skinned African American. Does this correlate with judgments in the world? There's a wonderful study, wonderful and terrible at the same time in a way. Last year we published in a journal I co-edit. Georgia, the state of Georgia, for 20 years identified the skin tone of every criminal defendant sentenced in that state on a 9-category scale. Why they did that is a little unclear, but they did. And of course, there's only one category white, and so there's all ranges in there. You can't predict the sentence based on race, other than if you exclude the white. In a way, what really matters is how dark was the skin tone. The darker the skin tone, controlling for type of crime, criminal history, all the things you can control for when you know all the data, the darker the skin tone, the longer the sentence the person got. It's somewhat older data because Georgia stopped doing this quite a while ago, but in fact that correlation is in there. I think that just is the kind of thing the judges are cueing off of. So what do we see in the judges? We do see a pattern of when they're careful, when they're on guard, they don't produce disparities. When they're not being careful, when they're in a different setting, and we have a couple of studies in which we do see differences. It's typically not in criminal context. We have some family court settings where we do see disparities between how the judges treat litigants. Because I think they're not expecting it quite as much there. It's not an area they worry about as much. Whereas the criminal justice system, they all kind of know that statistic on marijuana or statistics like it, and so they worry about it. And in fact, they're on guard. So that helps. That's system 2 at work. That's deliberative, that's careful. System 1, however, gets triggered in a case like this. We kind of are asking them, begging them to guess, and so then they rely on their intuitions. The terrible thing about those faces, by the way, all 5 of those faces are people who have been convicted of a capital crime in Pennsylvania. They come from a study done by Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a professor at Stanford, and one of my colleagues on the Cornell faculty. What they did is they took the mud shots of all defendants who were convicted of capital crimes in Pennsylvania since the moratorium on capital punishment was lifted in the mid-70s, up until, I think, 2005 is where they stopped. They had 352 African Americans who were convicted of capital crimes. Some of them got the death penalty by the jury, then affirmed by the judge. Some of them didn't. So the question is, can you predict whether they got the death penalty or not based on the degree to which they are stereotypically African American faces? The answer is sort of, unfortunately. Here's the result. When the victim was African American, the face of the person predicted nothing. When the victim was white, however, it was a huge effect. It was really sort of all the difference in the world. If you were above the median in terms of the degree to which the face is stereotypically African American, then there was a 60% chance that person was sentenced to death. When it was below the median, it's 20% when it was a white victim. Again, the undergraduates don't even know what they're doing. They're just sorting faces. And yet, when it's a white victim, they can kind of predict whether the person is assigned the death penalty or not. So it's kind of a big effect and a very disturbing one at that. Okay. Let me talk about one more study related to this. This is a study by Josh Carrells at the University of Colorado. It's become very familiar. He's trying to study sort of intuitive decisions about whether to shoot or not shoot. And he creates this kind of a video game in which he gives his undergraduate research subjects, in most cases, he has adults from the community and police officers, you'll see. He gives them a fake weapon and points them at a screen and then shows them a person will appear who will either be holding an innocuous object like a cell phone, soda can, or the like, or a weapon. And it looks kind of like this, like the person will just appear and that person has a cell phone. Hopefully the subjects don't shoot. Or the person will appear and they're holding a weapon and hopefully they do shoot. Right? So it's shoot, no shoot is what they're looking for in the task. They vary the scene a little bit. They try to make the neighborhood look more or less insidious, which sort of matters a little bit. That person got a wallet, right? And this person has a gun. Okay. And this is data. Now let me walk you through it. So what he gets what he's looking for is error rates. When do you shoot? When you shouldn't? When do you not shoot? When you should? And when it's among his, there's really no difference really between his white subjects, research participants, and his African-American research participants. But so they're divided down the middle. But on the left, if you start with the white participants, when it's a white suspect, there's more errors in not shooting than shooting. But they're sort of the same when it's an African-American. So they refrain from shooting more when it's a white person when they shouldn't. And they shoot kind of equally when it's African-American. He's getting this bias that there's a caution to shoot when it's a white person. That caution is not there when it's an African-American. It's true among his African-American subjects as well. Okay. What about police? Of course, that's who really makes most of these decisions in a heartbeat. Police officers, they're more accurate than the students. Great. They do train. That's terrific. They don't show the racial disparity, in fact. They're very good. And in fact, he does eye tracking things. For African Americans, they look right to the ends, for police officers, they look right to the hands. When told they're in this task, they're not looking at the faces. They go right to the hands. Community members don't. They start with the face, and then they look for the hand. Police are trained differently. They've got practice with this, and that's another thing that can help too, because this is, of course, the kind of decision where you can't really stop and think. What helps in that context? Training helps in that context. By the way, what explains the reality out there in the world? Are the police shooting more African Americans? The data from this year are that the percentage of people who have been shot and killed by African Americans is about 25%. So that is disproportionate. African Americans are only 13% of the population. It's not the decision at the end, it doesn't seem. It's not that choice at the very end. Now, of course, there's a difference in the world and Josh Carrell's study. In the world, the police often know whether the person's African American or white before they pull the gun out, before they approach. This study, the person appears, and then they have to decide whether to shoot or not shoot all at once, which does sometimes happen. But in the world, the confrontation often builds a little more slowly, so we might not have a perfect analogy to the world out there. But the other thing we do know about the real world, there's an increasing amount of data on this. The number of confrontations between police and African Americans itself, whether they involve a shooting or not, is enormously higher. Right? There's an economist at Harvard, Roland Freer, who has this terrific study out now. He says you can't predict whether the police shoot or not at the last minute based on race, but you can predict that there's more likely to be a confrontation in the first place when there's an African American. So it's a sort of an upstream decision, right, which is in a way helpful to understanding how you might avoid this. It's those decisions made earlier in the confrontation before things are as heated. We're doing a pretty good job of training police at the back end, apparently. When they have to decide whether to shoot or not, they're pretty good. They're much more accurate than members of the community in general, and they're not expressing a racial bias. They're looking at what they should look at. They're trained to do that. It's before that where we're starting to see more confrontations. That explains the disparity in shootings in some sense that we see. Still a lot more data to be collected on that, but that's the trend in the data. So solutions, I've got 5 minutes for solutions, but here you go. Look, that last data I gave, the best thing you can possibly do if you're concerned, like I was in class, that maybe you're treating your students differently or you're treating the litigants before you differently or someone else differently based on an invidious bias, is actually simply to count what you're doing. I've been telling judges to do this repeatedly at conferences in the last couple of years. Just have your clerks keep track of your sentences by race and crime, and a few other statistics. You might get disparities that are perfectly explicable, right? The pattern of litigants who come before you, pattern of defendants who come before you might be different based on race. It's apt to be different, in fact. But in fact, just counting will help you sort of figure that out. Major League Baseball had an issue with this a few years ago. They did their own internal study, and what they found is that when you have a white umpire at the home plate, and you have a white batter and a Latino pitcher, strike zone's a little smaller. Now, what did they do about that? Well, they thought about getting rid of the umpires. Actually, you don't need the umpires anymore. The electronic strike zone can do it, but people like umpires. They like when you're going, yeah, strike. So they wanted to keep the umpires. All they did is have the umpires review their own data. They didn't tell them to do anything. They just showed them they showed a picture of the pitcher, a picture of the batter with the name underneath, and then they showed their pattern of balls and strikes. And the effect went away. Umpires corrected themselves. All they had to, now was that accountability? They knew they're being watched? Maybe. Was that they knew they were doing something? Maybe not. Maybe they just started to attend more carefully to where the strike zone is and started to ignore where the pitcher, where the batter is, or what the race of the pitcher or the batter are in some sense. Right? They corrected themselves. That's an amazing mechanism for avoiding bias in yourself. Just count what you're doing. What else? Anonymity helps. As I said, we grade our exams anonymous. It's not always possible, of course. There are wonderful studies on anonymizing things where effects just disappear. Got to be a little careful about it because sometimes, as happens with my students, if they are signaling subtly their race or their gender, or it gets signaled subtly based on neighborhood, or I've had judges say, well, maybe I could just not know the race of the person. That's probably impossible in a judicial setting, right? Neighborhoods are quite segregated still in the United States, so in fact, if you know the neighborhood, you know the context, it might be worse. You'll have a sense of the race, but not quite know it. Judges are actually better at avoiding bias when they're openly confronting the race and know that they know the race of the person and that they should try to avoid it. So you got to be careful. We always tell stopping and thinking any version that slows down a decision is going to help, that sort of focuses you on those factors that you're supposed to be thinking about in sentencing, the criminal defendant's history, what the nature of the crime was, those sorts of things. That helps enormously if you can slow down, stop and think, take a break, use a checklist. We advise judges to do that. What am I supposed to be looking at? Write it down, check it off. That helps a lot. It's not perfect. None of these are perfect, but they sort of work. And training and experience. As I said, with the police officers, you see a lot of practice in that setting. They learn to do something very different than most adults. One of the dilemmas, one of the impediments to better judgment, the egocentric bias. Psychologists do like to name this thing. This is, you might be familiar with this sort of, now I guess it's ended its run, the public broadcasting radio station, radio program, Lake Wobegon. Lake Wobegon is this fictitious place in Minnesota where all the men are strong, the women are good looking, and the children are above average. Well, all the children are above average, it turns out. If you ask people, are you better than average at a particular task, almost everybody tells you they're better than average. 87% of people who drive cars say they are less likely than the average driver to get into a car accident. Somebody's causing those accidents out there. It's the 13%. Yeah, they're doing a lot of damage. University professors are not immune. We did this at Cornell. A survey, are you a better instructor than the median instructor at Cornell? 94% of us are better than the median instructor. I know who the 6% are in my building too, by the way. But yeah, it's very natural as a professional to think of yourself as better than average at your task. There's one group of people that are very accurate. People who are, this is really true, people who are clinically depressed have very accurate assessments of their self-esteem. They're very good at knowing where they are in the pecking order, how good they are and how good they aren't, and it is not psychologically healthy. You're better off believing yourself to be better than average. It's part of being a professional. Who wants to go to work? I'm the worst judge in this court. No one will do that. I'm the worst professor. No one will do that. So it's healthy to think of yourself as better than average. It's motivating. It does, however, blind you to the potential for getting better. So this is a question we asked a few different groups of judges now, and this is just one example. We asked judges at a conference, relative to other judges attending this conference, how would you rate yourself as on avoiding racial bias in making decisions? 97% were better than the average. 2 judges in that group said they were below average. And both of them came to talk to me afterwards about why. And they were very honest about it. They said they were concerned. They had problems. They cited various examples of why they thought they were biased and what they were doing about it. In a way, they were the more honest group in that group with themselves and perhaps with me as well. That is an impediment. That sort of thinking of yourself as already doing the thing you need to do. A lot of self-reflection of the sort I described, counting, just being objective about it, find those things. That is really the best human beings can do. In the end, we sort of say, look, you should think it possible you could be wrong, that the answer might really be 5 cents after all. Thank you.